really great to be here today. And so one of the things I'm going to try to talk to you about is try to explain, they laid out a very nice past and where we're going, some of the kinds of things we can do. I don't know if you know this, but it's a lot harder than they made it seem. Like Chris made it seem like it was pretty easy to make that prediction rule. And it sounded like a great idea. I wrote it down, but it's going to be a little harder than that. And so one of the things I'm working on is trying to get everyone to understand what they need to do to make this kind of stuff happen. So the first thing I want to remind you about is when we talk about these unintended consequences or things that can go wrong, they can go wrong at almost any phase of your EHR implementation, from the design to the development. We implement things wrong all the time. We use them wrong all the time. Sometimes when we're trying to fix the things, we break them. And then sometimes when we evaluate them, we don't get the answers. A lot of the times we don't get the answers we expected. Sometimes we don't evaluate them correctly. And so it turns out it's been a lot harder for us to evaluate what's going on with these systems and just trying to understand if it really worked or not. So we have very little what I'd call evidence-based information about our clinical information system. So Joseph talked about many of those different kinds of systems in place and what works and what doesn't. I thought he was just showing like my career path when he was showing all those places, all those things. So I've worked at a lot of those institutions. And I suppose that's what's led me to a lot of this, to where I am right now in my career. Is I've spent a lot of time at these places that are supposed to be the leading organizations, and I've seen how hard it was and how hard they work, the dedication of the people, and I see the people now trying to get this meaningful use money and seeing where we've got 6 months to buy the system and implement it so we can get our meaningful use money. And I think about how long it's taken some organizations to put in clinical decision support or CPOE with clinical decision support, and it worries me that people are going to be cutting a lot of corners. So I know that whenever I go fast, I always make a lot more mistakes. So in a lot of the work that we've been doing over the past, I guess about 6 or 8 years now, I work a lot with Joan Ash at the Oregon Health Sciences University in Portland, and we've looked at a lot of where these unintended consequences go, and so we see stuff all the way from the hardware and software, and usually in informatics we sort of just disregard all of that stuff about the computer. We just assume it's going to work, we assume the data is going to get to where it is, the network will be functioning. That's not always the case, and we need to have situations in place. A lot of our new clinicians have never worked in an organization where it was paper-based, so they don't even know how to order something on paper, or how to get the results from the lab. So at my hospital, we work with a Memorial Hermann system. We had an extended downtime, and it turned out we couldn't get the lab results from the lab up to the floors. So we thought if we could get these final labs up to find out that the patients were normal, we could discharge them, but we couldn't get them from the lab. And someone said, well, why don't we have the people just walk up the steps or in the elevator? And we said, well, we got rid of all those people. That's how we got our return on investment. And so we had people in the lab that could run the labs, and we had the paper there, but we didn't have anywhere to get them. So now our strategy is to have the hospital volunteers go to the lab and start distributing laboratory results around the hospital in terms of a downtime. You don't think about that kind of stuff at the first, but this can happen. We also see a lot of problems with upgrades where you think you're going to just do a small upgrade and then you have to upgrade all your hardware to match the software requirements. And so many of you may have seen that when you tried to upgrade to Windows 7, say on your home computer, and you realized you couldn't do it. So when you do these kinds of problems, you can have problems with your data. You can have problems with the input, the storage, and the retrieval of all this data. And so the reason we have all these computer systems, we have the hardware and we have these applications, it's all about the data is what we're trying to keep track of, what we're trying to figure out what to do with our decisions. And so we have problems where we can have bugs in our software that either the vendors can make these bugs or we can configure them incorrectly that leads to bugs. Sometimes we have sort of poorly designed software where it's very difficult to use, and so a lot of our systems, the escape key is worn out on the computer keyboards because people have pushed it so many times to make the alerts go away. Turns out on my keyboard I noticed like the home keys, the J, K, L, SEM are sort of worn out, but the escape key is not worn out. When you go into your hospital, you'll notice the escape key is worn out. And then we have all all of these things can result in loss of our data, and that's the worst thing that can happen in our hospital information system. So we already talked a little about decision support and how things can happen and go wrong. I just want you to see this sign. I don't know if you can read this in the back, but it says, "Caution, this sign has sharp edges," and then down below it says, "Do not touch the edges of this sign." What you probably can't see is the most important part right there. It says, "Also the bridge is out ahead." And you'd think no one would ever put up a sign like that in our hospital system, but we do that all the time, where we put up an alert, and sometimes you have to scroll down to see the most important part of it, or we put up a laboratory result and you have to scroll to the right to see the most recent test results. And these kind of things, some of them are configuration problems, some of them are vendor limitations, some of them are just our inability to think ahead and think about who's using these systems. And so we've actually written a book, and there's a new version that just came out in February about decision support, trying to help organizations go through this process of putting in the decision support and trying not to make these kinds of mistakes that in retrospect seem sort of obvious. But if any of you have ever, I'm from Houston, Texas, and one of the things that upsets me the most, and so, you get a lot of, would you say 97% of your alerts are overridden? When you're in Houston, it's just freeways pretty much. And every time I'm driving in Houston, every time I come to an overpass, we call that a bridge because we have no water or nothing in Houston that would make you go over a bridge. It's all flat. We have these overpasses, and there's a sign when I go across this bridge, every bridge on the freeway in Houston. It says the bridge freezes before or bridge may be icy in cold weather. That is true, but it is not cold. It's 90 in Houston today, and the bridge is not frozen. So I was telling someone, I said, we could take those signs down like 9 months of the year and not lose any sensitivity at all, because 9 months of the year it's not even possible it can freeze. There's maybe a month when it sometimes gets below freezing, and I'm sure it's bad. And I said, well, maybe, I was in an audience like this, and I said, maybe if you were in Maine or something, you'd have a sign like that, and it would make sense. And this guy in the back says, if you put a sign up like that in Maine, we'd think you were an idiot, because the bridge has been frozen since November, and it's not going to be thawed until April. And everyone knows the bridge is frozen. So you don't need it. And so we do this in decision support all the time. We tell the oncologist that you're ordering a chemotherapy drug, and that could be dangerous. And they're like, that's why they came to me, to get that oncology drug. We don't check to see who is getting the alerts. We don't check to see where the patients are. You'd think we would learn something. We have problems with our human-computer interface, and a lot of times we have a mismatch between what we call the user's model, that's the way the user thinks it ought to work, and the way the computer thinks it, or the people that designed the computer think it ought to work. And I have a particular problem with scrolling. I don't know who thinks that everyone knows to scroll. And so if you send me an attachment in Outlook that has more than 3 things in it, there's a little scroll bar on my thing that I have to scroll on. So usually I send you back an email and say you didn't attach all the things you were supposed to attach, and then you send me back and say you need to scroll. And we see that all the time in our hospitals, where people are forgetting to scroll and missing important data. And so the developers think that a scroll is a perfectly normal thing to do, but a user does not think generally about scrolling. And horizontal scrolling is even worse. So what happens is when we can't scroll is we're losing what we call situation awareness. It's the idea that we can't see all the information. And so those of you who have been in the field for a long time remember when we used to have these small computers with small screens that we didn't used to be able to show very much information on the screen. Now we show a whole bunch of information on that small screen, and we just have to go like that because we've got our bifocals and we can't read the small print. So if you ever see, it seems like our workforce is getting to be the same age as me, and so we see a lot of people struggling to get the right distance from the screen because our screens are so small. So when I'm too far away, I can't see it because it's too small, and when I'm too close, I can't see it because I can't get my bifocals to work right. And so we're always in this situation where we're not getting all of the data, and a lot of the times we have to go to multiple screens to see that data. So we have to work on it. We have problems with our pick lists, and so I'm sure you're all familiar with this juxtaposition error where you wanted to send it to the case manager and tell the patient you made a mistake and could they call them, and instead you send it to the patient's lawyer, and like that. And this happens at the speed of light, so you can't chase after it. That's impossible. You can't get there. Once it leaves, you can't get there before it gets there. And we're doing that a lot. We call that a tightly coupled system that's moving at the speed of light. So as soon as that mistake happens, I don't know if you've ever gotten one of those email messages that says, please disregard this email. Like, that, all that means is let's go read that one for sure. You could put urgent on it, but you could just send a retraction to get everyone to read it too. I can't tell you how many times I've replied all when you're not supposed to reply to all. And they're right beside each other, It's like they did that on purpose for people just like me. So we also put in our systems, and we're reducing a lot of face-to-face communication. And when we do this, a lot of times we have what we call the illusion of communication, where I send you an email and I think that you got the message, but you didn't, and then I start thinking bad things about you because you haven't replied to me. And then maybe I send you another email criticizing some part of your family history or something about that, or all kinds of things I start thinking about, and I realize that I sent it to the wrong person. And so you never got that message. And so we do that all the time. And so a lot of the times now, we're causing people to do double work. So now you put in a stat order, and you also have to call someone to make sure they saw the computer. So it's like, I call you and say, check the computer to see my email, and then fax me the result back. And we were supposed to reduce work. We were supposed to make things easier and faster. And instead, we're documenting better, we're getting our quality measures better, but we're making a lot more work for people. And so we're trying to figure out how to do that. Now, all of this work has led to some important changes, I think. And so an Institute of Medicine just came out with a new report in November on health information technology and safety, and talking about these poorly designed systems and poorly implemented systems. And we've written some papers about that, trying to argue for sort of some sort of an oversight for the implementation of this, sort of like the National Transportation Safety Board for airlines. And so the idea is that this group would come in and investigate if you had an accident in your hospital. When we first wrote that, someone said, well, what's an accident? How would we know? And so we came up with some criteria. And it's like one of the things, for example, is like if your hospital system's down for more than 24 hours. So the first time I said more than 8 hours. And I sent it to my CIO and CMO, and he said, if you investigated every time a computer system was down 8 hours, you'd just be constantly going all around the country because we have so many of those. So he said, well, let's go to 24 hours. And it turns out a lot of people have had downtimes of more than 24 hours. And so that's a tremendous hit on a hospital. And so we've got to figure out how to do that. So in response to that, the ONC has sponsored a project that we're working on. We call it the SAFER project. It stands for something nice like Safety Assurance Factors for Electronic Health Record Resilience. And so this project is trying to develop some of these guides, and they're both self-assessment guides, so we'll give them to everyone in their hospitals, and you go through and assess yourself, but when you assess yourself, you're not always as honest as you should be. And then we'll also, hopefully, there's going to be some external oversight. Someone like the Joint Commission or maybe some other agencies that'll come to your hospital like on a random basis and inspect your EHR. So right now the Joint Commission comes and makes sure everything's in ship shape, but they don't really look at the EHR as much as they should. And so any of you are familiar with the data that's in your EHR, or how many orders haven't been co-signed, or things like that in your system, you might know that if the Joint Commission would look at something like that, or if they knew how to look at something like that, or how to evaluate that, you'd be in trouble. So we're trying to develop some of these guides. And so we're doing this by focusing on what we call some of these key error-prone processes. And these are like provider order entry, lab results communication between providers, handling the downtimes in your organization, change control when you go through an upgrade. So these are particularly error-prone processes, and if you look at any of the small amounts of reported EHR-related errors that we have found, most of them have occurred in these kind of processes. And so we're developing what we call these red flags. And so this is like when you go to the doctor, they have all kinds of red flags. And there's things that you say that will get their attention. So like I had a knee operation, and after my operation, I called the doctor like a week after my operation and said, my knee really hurts. I think I need to come in. And he said, hurting is pretty normal, and I can see you in 4 weeks. I've got an opening on my schedule. And the next day, I told one of my friends, and he said, oh, you didn't say the right thing. So the next day I called, and I said, you know, the incision has a little red, and it looks like there's a little pus coming out of it. And he said, really? Why don't you come in? I've got a time in an hour. Can you come and see me? And I went in, and he looked at it, he goes, wow, that's really swollen too. I bet it hurts. And he drained off some fluid, and it felt a lot better. So that's a red flag, because with an orthopedic surgeon, like the only thing that can go wrong basically is you can get an infection. So he knew that, and so he saw that you were having an infection. As an information technologist, if I come into your hospital and say, where's your backup computer system? Now I went to a hospital and said this, and this guy pointed to that little USB drive that was sitting there connected to the thing, the Western Digital, and he said, it's right there. And I said, I was hoping for an off-site. He took it, he unplugged it, he said, okay, I'll take it home. And I said, that's not what I thought. Now, you think this is funny, but you know the HHS has a website where any more than 500 patients breaches of security. And if you look at that website, almost all of them are backup tapes that have been lost, that were not encrypted, that were put in someone's car and their car got stolen, or their laptop got stolen, or they lost it at security in the airport. Do they know that you can encrypt this laptop? It doesn't cost you almost nothing. And if you did that, you'd say, we lost the laptop, but it was encrypted, no problem. And we're doing this all the time, and that's a red flag to me if you tell me that you have backup tapes that are not encrypted. That would be terrible. So we also take what we call a sociotechnical approach. Now, this isn't all a technical problem. This is at least 50-50, a technical problem and a people problem. Now, my advisor was famous for saying it was 90% people, and I've been arguing with him since he said that about this, and so he's retired, so it's up to me now, and I'm sticking with 50-50. So, but we do look at these people things, and we see a lot of problems with people and the processes that we have in place. We're looking at both in and outpatient settings, and then we used to talk about large and small, but we think it's more sort of the complexity of the organization and your maturity of your IT infrastructure that's really important here. And we're developing this sociotechnical model. Now, this is the one the Institute of Medicine modified our model a little bit. We usually talk about in the technology group, we always separate sort of the hardware, the software, the clinical content or the decision support and the data, and the user interface all goes into that part of the model. But some of the people don't get so excited about the data or the content or anything like that, so they just all lump it into technology. But and then it also gives the people and the external environment, the organization, sort of the environment, sort of your work processes more of a importance. But let me just tell you, if your hardware is not working, it doesn't matter about any of that other stuff. And if your content is wrong or you lost all your data, it doesn't matter about your work processes, because your whole work process is going to be to find our data. I had a friend that his job was to change the time on the computer. You know how, like that spring ahead, fall back. His job was to come in the middle of the night and change the date on the computer. So he came in at 2 o'clock in the morning to change the time, and he got there and he thought, I can't exactly remember. So he pulled out the manual above his thing. He opened up the manual and it said to change the time on the clock, you type in the date like this. So he typed in the date and the time just like the example was there, hit return, walked home, got home. About a half hour later, people started calling the help desk and saying, all of the data is gone from the computer system. And he was like, what do you mean all of the data? It's just there, it's fine. And he started getting more and more calls. Now, a lot of people have a rule, like if you get like one call, it's just a crazy person, doesn't know how to use the system. If you get a few calls, maybe something's going on. So he came back to the hospital because you get a lot of calls. And he logged on to the ICU and looked, and he said, yep, no patients in the ICU. And no patients on 5 West. What's going on? So it turns out the way that the computer programs work to display stuff was it always said, the search said from now back to 1 week, look for the data. And it turned out when he changed the time, he changed now to 1976. So it was looking from 1976, a week before that, and there was no data in the computer system like that. You lost all the data. When you lose all the data, you got a real problem. So these are those key error-prone processes we've talked about, and so we're trying to develop guides in each of these areas. And these are the kind of questions or red flags that we're talking about. These are very simple. They should be obvious to everyone, yet I've been going to places and talking to people about them, and like I tell everyone, you should have at least 2 computers. Like if you have a big database server, you should have 2 of them. If you have a connection to the internet, you should have 2 of them, because one of them is going to break. A lot of doctors in small practice say, I can't afford 2, and I say, you need 2 because you can't afford not to have these things. Like all your mobile devices need to be encrypted. There's no excuse for that. Anyone in this room, it should also be backed up, because you know this is going to break. They're made to break. I mean, they're not made to break, but they're going to break. They should all have passwords, and so you shouldn't have like a cell phone with your email with no password or data on it. Just not like. Everyone should have a login to the system, and when you leave the system, you should terminate those logins. So a lot of times we don't do that. And one of our biggest problems in any organization is those employees that get fired. They're called mad employees. And so they will do something to your system. And we should display the patient ID on every screen. Too many times we don't show enough information about the patients. And then we should have interfaces to all our ancillary systems. So with that, I'll remind you that I'm not trying to scare you away from EHRs or anything like that. I mean, this is the most important thing that could improve healthcare. I mean, this is like antibiotics. They're good, but they can also hurt you. Too many of them are bad. So we're trying to help us to discover and understand these issues. I'm trying to understand where the hazards are so we can put in place management processes and people processes to deal with them so we can hopefully prevent and overcome these problems. And I'd also point you to our book on overcoming adverse consequences. That was supposed to be a picture of when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And I suggested that, and they said that made it look too much like their nutrition books, so all I got was the lemons on the cover. So with that, thank you very much.